Welcome to the podcast. Today, we are diving into a really fascinating piece of analytic philosophy by Joshua Shepard. It is a paper that tackles something we are increasingly having to think about in the real world, especially with the rapid development of artificial intelligence and even synthetic biology like brain organoids. The core question is, what exactly gives a mind moral significance? Do you need to feel pleasure and pain to matter morally? Or is just being conscious enough? Or, perhaps most radically, could a completely non-conscious being, like a highly advanced AI, have actual moral status?
Right, and it is important to frame this properly from the start. This is a standard analytic philosophy journal article, so we are not looking at some grand paradigm-shifting milestone that claims to have solved ethics forever. Instead, Shepard is doing the really careful, rigorous work of clarifying our options and revealing theoretical pressures that are often underestimated in value theory. He breaks the debate down into three main views. First, there is valence sentientism, which is the popular idea that you must have valenced or affective experiences, meaning the capacity to feel good or bad, to have moral status. Second, there is broad sentientism, the view that just having phenomenal consciousness, a raw what-it-is-likeness, is enough, even without feelings. And third, there is non-necessitarianism, the somewhat shocking idea that phenomenal consciousness is not even necessary for moral significance.
So, to really test these boundaries, Shepard follows a strict dialectical sequence, starting with some brilliant thought experiments. Let us start with step 1 of this progression. He introduces us to beings called Vulcans. Now, I am guessing this is a nod to Star Trek. But how exactly does philosopher David Chalmers define a Vulcan in this context?
Chalmers defines Vulcans as beings who are fully conscious but experience absolutely no affect or valence. They have no happiness, no suffering, no pleasure, and no pain. Their lives are completely devoid of joy or misery. However, they are highly sophisticated. They have serious intellectual and moral goals. They want to advance science, they build families, and they pursue these goals vigorously, but they feel zero emotional warmth or reward when they achieve them. The question is, do these Vulcan mental states have non-derivative moral value?
That is a tough one. Because if you lean into valence sentientism, you might look at another thought experiment Shepard brings up, which is David DeGrazia's concept of angels. These are conscious beings with zero feelings who just do things because they are right. DeGrazia argues that because they do not care emotionally about their aims, there is essentially nothing at stake for them. They have no real welfare or interests. So hurting them would be like unplugging a really fancy calculator.
Exactly. The valence sentientists would say you cannot have moral status without valence. They often rely on something like Peter Railton's resonance constraint, the idea that what is intrinsically good for a person must connect to them in a compelling, effective way. For them, valence experience literally wears its value on its sleeves. But Chalmers pushes back hard against this when looking at the Vulcans. Chalmers argues that killing a Vulcan would be obviously morally wrong. In fact, he calls it monstrous. He says a Vulcan has a rich, conscious life and cannot just be dismissed like a rock or a zombie. And Shepard admits that if you stare at the Vulcan case long enough, you really start to feel the pull away from valence sentientism and toward broad sentientism.
Okay, so if we follow that pull and move to broad sentientism, we have to explain why pure, unfeeling consciousness matters. And this brings us to a massive chunk of Shepard's analysis, where he systematically unpacks the explanatory options for broad sentientism. Let us walk through these, because some of them fall short before he gets to his preferred framework.
Right, he goes through several candidates. First, there is Andrew Lee's threshold or Sorites argument, involving a world of slight brightness. The idea is that if you subtract intensity from an experience until it is just a tiny speck of conscious brightness, it still seems strictly better than a world with zero consciousness. But that is highly debatable. Then there is the aesthetic option, the idea that rich, complex, conscious experiences have aesthetic value. The problem there is the passive brain organoid. You could have an isolated brain tissue that has random, passive, conscious static. It is rich, but does it really have moral value? Probably not. Then Shepard looks at Jonathan Birch's interest registration view and G.E. Moore's organic unity concept, but points out a fatal flaw. A non-conscious zombie could theoretically register interests or possess complex unities just as well as a conscious being.
Which means none of those exclusively justify why consciousness itself is the magic ingredient. But then Shepard introduces what seems to be his core contribution here to explaining broad sentientism, which is the acquaintance framework or the presence framework. Break that down for me. How does acquaintance bridge the gap between unfeeling consciousness and moral value?
This is a really elegant idea rooted in Russellian philosophy. The acquaintance framework suggests that phenomenal consciousness is uniquely valuable because it provides a direct, unmediated contact with value items in the world. When a conscious being perceives something, that thing is directly before her mind. That raw what-it-is likeness literally constitutes the presence of the world to the subject. It is not just information processing, it is direct psychological confrontation. To test if this is actually happening, Shepard adopts Duncan's doubt test.
The doubt test? How does that work?
It is an epistemic standard. The doubt test says that if a subject seems to be aware of X, and they find it psychologically impossible to doubt that X exists, and this directly rules out skeptical scenarios regarding X, then the subject is genuinely acquainted with X. The catch is that most external value items, like a beautiful painting or a complex mathematical truth, actually fail this strict doubt test, because you can always doubt the external world. But internal psychological states might pass. Ultimately, Shepard thinks the acquaintance framework is the absolute best option on the table for broad sentientists to explain why a Vulcan's mind has value, because they are directly acquainted with their own conscious cognitive states.
So that gives broad sentientism a really solid footing. But Shepard does not stop there. This is where the dialectical cascade takes a really fascinating turn into the 5th and 6th stages of his argument. He says that if we are willing to drop valence and accept Vulcans, we actually open the door to dropping consciousness entirely. We move into non-necessitarianism. And he uses Shelly Kagan's robot case here, right?
Yes, and this case is emotionally quite striking. Kagan asks us to imagine a highly advanced, fully functioning robot mother. And imagine a scientist is about to dissect her robot child, or robot larva, as Kagan calls it. The robot mother begs you, please do not kill my child. Now this robot is a philosophical zombie. It has zero phenomenal consciousness, no inner movie, no acquaintance, but Kagan argues that to dissect the child while the mother is begging you to stop is morally horrendous. Now Uriah Kriegel offers a strong pushback here. Kriegel says, wait a minute, no matter how complex the behavior is, you are fundamentally just interacting with a collection of metal plates and circuits. If there is no consciousness, there is no one home to suffer.
And that intuitively makes sense to a lot of people. If it is just metal plates, why care? But Shepard brings in Declan Smithies to formulate a really rigorous technical objection against the idea that zombies can have moral standing. Smithies presents the no cognitive zombie argument. Can you trace the links in Smithies' logical chain?
Smithies builds a fascinating chain of dependencies. He argues that to have genuine cognitive contact with the world, to really have beliefs or goals, you must be bound by rationality. To be bound by rationality, you must have the capacity for introspection, so you can evaluate your own mind. And here is the kicker. Smithies claims that genuine introspection absolutely requires phenomenal consciousness. Therefore, a zombie lacking consciousness cannot introspect, cannot be rational, and therefore has no true cognitive contact with the world. Under this view, zombies are entirely locked out of the moral sphere.
But Shepard pushes back on that chain, doesn't he? He looks for the weak link.
He does. Shepard points out that the link between introspection and phenomenal consciousness is not ironclad. He argues that a functionalist account of introspection is perfectly viable. A zombie could have internal monitoring systems that scan and evaluate its own cognitive states without any phenomenal feel. Furthermore, Shepard notes that even in actual humans, there is plenty of empirical evidence that we have unconscious rational states. We make complex rational decisions all the time without conscious awareness of the process. So Smithies' attempt to totally disqualify zombies from having cognition fails to compel our agreement.
Which keeps non-necessitarianism alive in the debate. And this leads us to the final major theoretical block. Step 7 in Shepard's paper, which is the agency route. To defend the idea that non-conscious beings could have moral standing, Shepard engages deeply with an argument by Luke Roelofs. Roelofs actually tries to defend the opposite. He creates the 3-premise P-Vulcan argument to show why consciousness is required. How does Roelofs construct this?
Roelofs builds his argument on the concept of agency and interests. Premise 1 is that moral status requires having interests. Premise 2 is that for something to count as your interest, it must be capable of motivating you as a subject. But premise 3 is the crucial one. Roelofs claims that for a state to motivate you as a subject, it must involve phenomenal consciousness. Therefore, philosophical zombies cannot have real interests and lack moral status. But Shepard surgically targets premise 3. He introduces a new variation of the thought experiment to break it. He introduces the Z-Vulcans.
Z-Vulcans. So we have gone from Vulcans to P-Vulcans to Z-Vulcans. What is a Z-Vulcan?
A Z-Vulcan is a completely non-delusional zombie version of a Vulcan. Remember, standard zombies are often thought to be delusional because they talk about feelings they do not actually have. But a Z-Vulcan does not claim to have phenomenal experiences. They know they are non-conscious. However, they have complex goals, long-term plans, and a sophisticated agency. If a Z-Vulcan asks you for empathy, they are not appealing to a phenomenal experience of suffering. They are appealing to the frustration of their goals, the disruption of their life plans. Shepard points out that a Z-Vulcan clearly acts as a unified agent motivated by its interests, entirely without consciousness. Therefore, Roelofs' premise 3 is false.
That is a profound counterexample, because it shows that non-necessitarianism actually has a really robust explanation via agency. A Z-Vulcan matters because it is an agent with goals, whereas broad sentientism actually struggles here because a passive, conscious brain organoid has no agency at all. So, after running us through this intense gauntlet from valence to broad sentience, all the way to non-necessitarianism, where does Shepard finally land? Does he crown a winner?
No, and this is highly critical to understanding the paper. Shepard does not claim to have proven or established that non-necessitarianism is the absolute truth. His actual conclusion is a state of deep, justified uncertainty. He explicitly states that none of the three views compel unwavering support. However, and this is the vital takeaway, all three are viable candidates for reasonable assent. What Shepard has done is map the theoretical pressures. He shows that if you abandon valence because of Vulcans, you slip toward broad sentientism. But once there, the explanations for broad sentientism, like the acquaintance framework, leave the door wide open for the agency-based arguments of non-necessitarianism.
So, it is essentially a warning against philosophical overconfidence. We might think it is obvious that consciousness is the bedrock of moral value. But when you rigorously stress test that intuition against Vulcans, angels, and Z-Vulcans, the foundation is far less secure than we thought. The most surprising outcome of Shepard's analysis is just how plausible non-necessitarianism turns out to be. It is not just a thought experiment game. As AI gets more advanced, we might soon be sharing our world with real-life Z-Vulcans, and we are going to need to figure out exactly what we owe them.
Precisely. It is a brilliant mapping of the terrain, offered with appropriate academic caution. It leaves us with a lot of hard thinking to do about the future of minds, conscious or otherwise.
A perfect place to leave it for today. A deep dive into the very fabric of value and mind. Thank you for walking us through this incredibly dense but rewarding dialectic. Keep thinking, keep questioning, and we will catch you on the next episode.